Jake Mitchell moved into his dream neighborhood only to be relentlessly harassed by his neighbor Greg Thompson, with petty code violations but behind Greg's quiet, watchful demeanor hid a shocking secret and illegal rental scam, running right under everyone's noses. Armed with the truth, Jake turned the tables in a way Greg never saw coming. But wait until you hear how justice was served and the unexpected twist that left everyone speechless. When Jake Mitchell first laid out on the house in Oak Ridge, it felt like a dream come true. The street was lined with neatly trimmed trees, the kind that cast long, friendly shadows over the quiet sidewalks. The air was filled with the faint hum of sprinklers and the occasional distant bark of a dog. His new yard was everything he'd wanted: spacious, sunny, and perfect for the vegetable garden he'd always planned to grow. And the neighbors, at first glance, they seemed warm and welcoming. Friendly waves were exchanged as moving trucks rolled in, and Mrs. Harper from 2 doors down even baked him a welcome cake. But then there was Greg Thompson. Greg lived directly across the street in a house that looked identical to Jake's, but somehow less inviting. While other neighbors came to introduce themselves, Greg didn't. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, his eyes following every box Jake carried inside. Jake told himself it was nothing, just a reserved guy keeping to himself. He wasn't the type to judge someone too quickly. Except Greg didn't stop watching. Whenever Jake came out to mow the lawn or take out the trash, Greg would be there, standing by his front window or leaning against his mailbox, pretending to adjust the flag, but clearly keeping an eye on Jake. It wasn't overtly hostile, but it was unnerving. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being evaluated, every move scrutinized. Still, Jake decided to give Greg the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe he was a recluse. Jake even waved a few times, hoping to break the ice, but Greg never waved back. Then one sunny morning, Jake found the bright orange notice stuck to his front door: code violation, unmaintained yard. Confused, Jake glanced at his lawn, sure the grass had gotten a little long after a week of rain, but it wasn't anywhere close to unmaintained. His flower beds were weed-free, his driveway clear. The notice felt excessive. Shrugging, Jake mowed the lawn that afternoon, chalking it up to bad luck or an overzealous city inspector. He even laughed about it with his girlfriend, later joking that he was off to a rocky start with the HOA. But then another notice appeared. This time it was for a loose fence panel. Jake frowned, walking the perimeter of his yard. There was one slightly wobbly board, but calling it a code violation seemed absurd. He tightened it up, grumbling under his breath about how ridiculous it was to nitpick over something so small. When the third notice came, a warning about an unregistered vehicle in his driveway, Jake's patience wore thin. The car in question was his brother's, left there for a few days while he was visiting. It wasn't abandoned, and it certainly wasn't illegal. Now Jake was mad. He decided to contact the city to figure out what was going on. The call started off polite. A city clerk asked for his address, pulled up the records, and started listing the complaints. When Jake pressed for details, the clerk hesitated. Well, she finally said, her voice a little quieter, these violations were reported by a concerned neighbor. Jake's stomach sank. Which neighbor, he asked, though he already knew the answer. There was a brief pause before the clerk confirmed it. Greg Thompson. Jake hung up, his mind racing. Why? What had he done to Greg? They barely exchanged words. Was it something as petty as Jake parking on the street one day, or was Greg just the type who couldn't stand anyone new moving into his neighborhood? Whatever the reason, Jake couldn't believe it. The man who had been silently watching him for weeks was now actively making his life miserable. Determined to figure out what Greg's problem was, Jake decided to keep a closer eye on his reclusive neighbor. At first, Greg's house seemed unremarkable. Quiet, unassuming, and meticulously maintained. The blinds were almost always drawn, and no one ever seemed to linger on the porch. It was the kind of house that blended into the background, the last place you'd expect to harbor secrets. But the more Jake watched, the more certain he became that something wasn't right. It started with the cars at odd hours of the day and night. Unfamiliar vehicles would pull up to Greg's driveway or park along the curb. They weren't neighbors Jake recognized most of the cars on the block, and they Didn't stay long. Some arrived early in the morning, headlight off, while others left in the dead of night. The people were just as unusual. They varied from business professionals with roller bags to backpackers in worn sneakers. They never lingered, never spoke to Greg outside, and never seemed to stay more than a day or two. Jake's curiosity simmered until it boiled over. Something strange was happening, and he was going to figure out what. One night, well past midnight, Jake decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he slipped out of his back door and crept toward Greg's property. The street was eerily quiet, with only the faint chirping of crickets to break the silence. Jake's heart pounded as he crossed the lawn, careful to stick to the shadows. He couldn't explain why he felt so nervous. Greg wasn't home, and even if he was, Jake wasn't breaking any laws. Technically reaching the side of the house, Jake crouched low beneath a window. The blinds were slightly tilted, leaving just enough of a gap for him to peer inside. Taking a deep breath, he raised his phone and angled it toward the window. What he saw made him blink in disbelief. Inside, the room looked nothing like the typical living space of a suburban home. It had been stripped bare and divided into cramped makeshift quarters. Thin walls had been erected to carve the space into several tiny rooms, each barely big enough for a bed and a suitcase. Cheap flickering light bulbs hung from exposed wires, casting a harsh, dingy glow. It looked like something out of a motel, a far cry from the tidy facade Greg presented to the neighborhood. Jake moved to another window and saw more of the same cramped quarters, minimal furniture, and signs of temporary living. He could even hear muffled voices coming from inside, though he couldn't make out the words. He quickly snapped a few photos, careful to stay out of sight, and retreated back to his yard. The pieces were falling into place. Greg wasn't just a quiet bachelor keeping to himself. He was running a full-blown illegal operation. He had converted his house into a series of under-the-table units, essentially turning it into a secret hostel. Jake's initial shock gave way to a seething anger. The man who had been reporting him for minor code violations was blatantly breaking nearly every housing regulation in the book, and he wasn't just being sneaky about it, he was profiting from it. Jake couldn't let it go. He needed proof, and that meant digging deeper. Over the next few days, JB spent hours combing through online rental platforms and local classified. Sure enough, he found the listings advertised under generic usernames with vague descriptions like cozy private room for short stays or affordable housing option in quiet neighborhood. The photos in the ads matched the rooms Jake had seen through the windows. Greg had even gone so far as to use stock images for some of the listings to make them look more professional. It wasn't just shady, it was outright illegal. No permits, no inspections, no fire safety precautions. Greg had turned his house into a cash cow at the expense of his neighbors' safety and peace of mind. Jake knew he'd stumbled onto something big, but what frustrated him most wasn't just the scam itself. It was the audacity. Greg had been reporting him, harassing him over minor infractions, all while running a full-scale illegal operation right under everyone's noses. Jake couldn't let him get away with it. Jake was seething. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was like fuel to a fire. Here was Greg Thompson, a man who had made it his personal mission to harass Jake over petty, inconsequential code violations while running an illegal operation that violated every rule in the book. The irony was staggering, and the unfairness of it stung deeply. Jake couldn't let it slide, not this time. For a brief moment, he considered confronting Greg directly. He imagined walking up to his front door armed with his photos in the listings he'd found online and throwing it all in Greg's face, but he knew better. Greg wasn't the type to admit defeat, and an argument wouldn't get the job done. No, Jake needed to play this smart. He needed to hit Greg where it hurt. The next morning, armed with his evidence, Jake drove straight to City Hall. He wasn't sure what kind of reaction he'd get, but as he sat down with a city inspector and laid out everything, photos of the converted rooms, screenshots of the illegal rental listings, and even a timeline of suspicious activity, he watched the inspector's expression shift from curiosity to shock. This is extensive, the inspector said, flipping through Jake's evidence. If even half of this is accurate, his Serious violation of zoning and safety regulations, and those exposed wires in the photos, that's a massive fire hazard. The inspector shook his head, muttering something about how cases like this could have ended in tragedy. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll handle it from here. Jake left City Hall feeling a mix of vindication and anticipation. He didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. He wanted justice. Greg had spent months using the system as a weapon against him, but now the tables had turned. The city moved fast. Within days, inspectors were swarming Greg's property. They measured every inch of the house, documenting the unauthorized modifications and flagging countless violations, safety regulations, zoning laws, fire codes. It seemed Greg had broken them all. The inspectors even interviewed some of Greg's tenants who revealed that they'd been paying exorbitant rent for substandard, unsafe conditions. It wasn't just illegal, it was exploitative. It didn't take long for Greg to realize who was behind the investigation. Late one evening, as Jake sat on his porch enjoying a quiet beer, he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps storming up his driveway. He barely had time to set down his drink before Greg appeared, ready-faced and furious. You, Greg spat, pointing a shaking finger at Jake. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you, ruining my life like this? Do you have any idea what you've done? Jake stood up slowly, refusing to be intimidated. What I've done, he shot back, his voice calm but laced with anger. What about what you've done, Greg? Harassing me with code violations for weeks, making my life hell while you've been breaking every rule in the book right under everyone's nose. Don't talk to me about ruining lives. Greg stepped closer, his voice rising. I had no choice. You don't understand. I don't want to hear your excuses. Jake interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. You thought you could weaponize the rules against me while ignoring them yourself. Well, guess what? Now we're playing by your rules. For a moment, Greg just stood there, his chest heaving. Jake could see the panic in his eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed scheme was unraveling. You could have come to me, Greg muttered, finally, his voice lower now, almost pleading. We could have worked something out. Jake crossed his arms, unmoved. You didn't come to me when you started reporting my property over nothing. You didn't come to me when you decided to turn this neighborhood into your personal profit center. You chose this, Greg. Now you're going to deal with the consequences. Greg didn't respond. He just shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and stalked off into the night. Jake watched him go, a strange mix of satisfaction and pity settling in his chest. He didn't feel triumphant, just relieved that the harassment was over and justice was finally being served. The fallout hit Greg hard. The city condemned parts of his house, evicted his tenants, and slapped him with hefty fines. His rental scam unraveled in record time, forcing him to shut everything down. Jake had expected to feel victorious, but watching Greg pace his yard, shoulders clumped, stirred an unexpected twinge of pity. One evening, Greg knocked on Jake's door. He looked defeated, his voice trembling as he said, I just needed the money after my divorce. I couldn't keep up. The rentals were my only way to stay here. Jake didn't forgive him, but replied firmly, you could have asked for help instead of dragging me into your mess. Greg nodded, eyes downcast, and walked away without another word. Months later, peace returned to the neighborhood. Greg sold the house and moved away, leaving Jake's dream neighborhood truly his own. At last, Jake felt relief and closure. Sometimes justice isn't about triumph but understanding.